Yo, what's up, guys? So today I want to talk about Lost Ark. So I had made a bunch of videos and then I was putting it together and editing the video and stuff like that. But then last night, Lost Ark mobile preview just dropped, and so I wanted to kind of talk about my kind of predictions for LOAON, but then also have that be semi in the background, kind of while we're thinking about it, and then just keeping in mind like what they're getting over there and what could very easily come to our version of the game. So this video isn't really going to include a lot of those details, and it's also not really going to include the things that we know are already coming this summer. Just want to talk again about like kind of keeping that in our frame of mind, but then also kind of thinking about what could come next, and then maybe some copium takes that I have. So make sure if you aren't familiar with those other topics, Memo has videos. Other people have videos reacting to like the AGS announcements and stuff like that. So yeah, just go ahead and go check out that kind of stuff. So really quickly, I just want to say two disclaimers really quick. It is possible that they don't give us anything new. I don't think that's very likely. They always end up holding things close to the chest during low on. So I'm hoping that they'd still have some cards left to play and haven't showed or talked about yet. And then I'm also just going to try and do this in a relatively quick manner. There's not a ton of time left before low on, so I do want to get my thoughts and stuff out beforehand. So it's going to be a relatively kind of quick video. So there might be things that I miss or things that I don't fully explain. So feel free to ask questions down below or whatever, and I'll say stuff in the comments and whatnot. Okay, so my number one wish list thing for Lost Ark is we need a lot of things in Lost Ark, but I genuinely think one of the most important things for the the NA audience or just in global in general is going to be improving the experience for returning players as well as new players. And I think realistically, we can all agree that the game at this point shouldn't really start until like 1660. So I think at this point, when you make a new character, you need to be getting to 1640 immediately. So, maybe Paradise can help with this in some way. And I believe that the AGS video specifically said that it would help make new characters. We'll have to wait and see how that plays out. But I think everyone needs to start at bare minimum 1640 and then make it easier to get to 1660 and then even potentially even easier to get to 1680. Although none of those things are too difficult right now, and we kind of done that recently with our NA East account. We were able to get to 1660 relatively easily with the help of some events and stuff like that. I still think it's too expensive, but it's really important that new players or returning players get to at least 1660 so that way they're doing all of the tier 4 raids. That's important for a couple of different reasons, mostly because it doesn't really make sense for them to get tier 3 mats and go back and do things that are really hard like Daemine when they're also, coming back to the game or coming to the game for the first time and doing stuff like Behemoth, right? The difficulty is just far too great of a spike between those two raids, even though I personally think that Daemine is one of the best raids that they've ever made, or at least Gate 3 was in particular. I still think it's just not an appropriate spot to put new players or returning players. So naturally with that, there's a little bit of an issue with Echidna. I would also hope that they would nerf maybe Echidna a little bit and make it a little more forgiving than it currently is. I know most players don't really mind it, but I do think it would be kind of hard for a brand new player to jump straight into something like Echidna hard mode potentially. So yeah, making those adjustments I think would be really, really valuable to the new player and again the returning player experience. I think what they need to focus on in general is like those two things, and they can really bring back hopefully a lot of players with the introduction of Paradise and other things that hopefully will be covered as we talk more about like what I think is going to be coming and stuff like that. So this is for me. Okay, this is for me. The next thing that I hope, and maybe this will be copium, but I really hope what they do is they have Loa on this weekend, and then they just shadow drop female Paladin for everyone across the board. Have it be a global release, and just have it be something really big and exciting that happens immediately after Loa on. So usually this kind of thing can sort of kind of happen for KR, but they've never done globally, and I think a global release would add a lot of hype. And so if they were to say, look at all this stuff for female Paladin, isn't she looking so cool? And you can play her today. I think a lot of people would be really excited and really hyped. People do like those kind of shadow drop stuff that happened recently with Splitgate and their battle royale, for an example. And then a big one to note was like the finals being dropped during Summer Games Fest a couple of years ago or whatever. So I like those kind of big hype moments. And so not as much important for the game, but for me personally, that would be a massive win. Okay, so back to more important things for the game. This is probably my second most important thing that I want them to hit is more types of content that encourage social activity. So I'm being purposely vague here because this can be done in a lot of different ways. And actually, they did show some of them in the Lost Ark mobile preview last night. They showed that you're going to be able to throw like festivals and contests and things like that. It seems like in the new spaces in Lost Ark Mobile, and that looks like something that would be really really fun. It has nothing to do with gear progression. However, on the flip side, you have things like Crystal of Atlan, which has a social system built into their actual gameplay. So when you're doing your dailies and stuff like that, you can come across other players, and when you do, and even it not necessarily other players, sometimes it can be NPCs using the other player characters. We'll maybe get more into that later. You can give them likes, and that those likes get turned into currency that you can then purchase things with. So it's a system that's literally designed in a way to make people have positive social interactions. And I think any system like that that Lost Ark can implement would be really, really important. And to be honest, I think the game desperately needs it because the community, especially right now, is in imposter mode. And what I mean by that is everyone's got the finger out. They're all pointing at each other and being like, "You're an imposter. You're an imposter." Like, your damage isn't very good. You're an imposter, or you're messing up the mechs. And to be honest, I've been doing this a little bit recently myself. I can't tell you the number of times I've complained about Thunderbolt Masters dying in phase 1 of like normal mode Mordoom the last 2 weeks. So, I need to definitely rein back on that myself, but my point remains the same, is that we need systems in place to make people have positive social interactions instead of only those negative ones. And with one of those things, obviously like the res system and stuff like that, improved quality of life, making homework easier and less punishing. So anything that I think is, going to be relegated to homework should always be easy. And I want them to have that kind of philosophy going forward. If something's meant to be hard, it should be hard and then not homework. You know what I mean? It should be hard, you get the reward, and then you choose to go back or something like that. Not something you have to do on a regular basis. Hard things on a regular basis just don't really work, I think, long term in games like this. And with that, we'll swing into our homework segue. So if you're familiar with Crystal of Atlan, and I've talked about it a few times on the channel and stuff like that, I've been playing it a lot. And there's a really, really cool system that they have. And basically, for a lot of the homework, if you queue and the queue is taking too long, what they'll do is they'll take other player characters that are for people that, are in your server or whatever, and then they'll fill it using bots. So they'll take those characters, bring them into your group, and have an AI run the character for them. The really cool part about that is it allows you to have social interactions, positive social interactions with people in your community, even though those people aren't even necessarily online or doing the content. And so you just passively are earning extra likes, getting more of that currency for people getting to use your character, basically. It's a really cool system, and I really like how it works for that daily content. So I could see this being added to things like Guardian Raids or whatever, right? Lost Ark Mobile added this kind of system to their flexible raid system, which I don't think I'm personally a very big fan of. Final Fantasy XIV does this, and I think that they're actually the original people that came up with this kind of idea, is that you basically get to run the dungeons in the story and while you're leveling up with story mode characters, so that way you can play the story through entirely solo. I think that's a really good implementation of a system like this because the story is kind of important for that game, and it kind of takes you out when you have to, interact with other people and stuff like that. So it allows you to have a more immersive experience, especially because the dungeons that you're running are those story characters. And so I would really like to see something like this be done. So let's say I do a guardian raid and I want to just queue with bots, or the queue's taking too long and it fills it with bots. I would love it for it to be like, okay, well, you're not a support, so you need a support. So maybe Nineveh will be a support, or Beatrice or something like that. Or in the other game, Final Fantasy 14, you'd have like a tank. So like Balthor could be a tank. Maybe it's just a destroyer kind of thing where they can taunt every once in a while. Point being is I like the use of bots for things like dailies. I'm not sure it works for things like raids. And what I mean behind that is you don't want your MMO to be solely about solo content. And I know that's a point of like contention for people in the community right now. A lot of people want more solo content. That's really not at the heart of an MMO. And I think it's okay to have content. And again, I'll go more into this in a second. I think it's okay to have content that's specifically made for solo mode, but not everything should be solo mode. There is a difference. And this is something that I've been praising Crystal of Atlan for quite heavily, is that they have content that is specifically designed, I think, from the ground up to be solo mode. Whereas in Lost Ark, a lot of our solo modes, are literally Frankenstein versions of 8-man content made to fit a single player. And that doesn't really work for a variety of reasons, but most importantly, it doesn't teach them how to do the same fight. It's like a different fight altogether, which one takes more dev time, I think personally, and also just in the long run doesn't teach them the same mechanics that they need to know when they end up going eventually into group play. Assuming that that is kind of the idea, and Smilegate has said this themselves, that they see solo mode as this kind of funnel for people to learn and the mechanics of the game and move into more of those end game pieces of content with teammates and stuff like that, which I think personally is a good idea. They're just not going about it the right way. So, and then kind of segueing again, I think it's really, really important that we have solo content that's made from the ground up to be solo mode content. And I think that this is kind of going to be where some of that paradise comes into play, but we don't really know for sure. But I think it's really, really, like I said, important that there's content that somebody can do and they can make some kind of meaningful progression by themselves. And I think currently, Smilegate thought that things like Chaos Dungeons and Una tasks would sort of fill that niche, and even maybe, life skills. But to be honest, none of them really do, and none of those things are very fun in their current iteration. Obviously, they could improve life skills and stuff like that too, but that's, a whole different topic and not really something I personally care a whole lot about. I think there's other things that they need to fix beforehand. Back to the point is that there should be content that is specifically designed to be solo mode. In World of Warcraft, we had something called the Mage Tower, which rewarded basically exclusive skins for that character that you could use and looked really cool. They looked amazing and people always wanted them. And so this is something that I think that they could take a lot of inspiration from. The boss fights are really, really cool, and they're designed to be very challenging and also require you to really truly understand your class. And I think this is something that Smilegate could do to kind of fill this kind of niche of needing solo mode content. Having that kind of Mage Tower experience, I think, would make Lost Ark a lot better and give those players and that want solo mode stuff to do and stuff that they could potentially chase, even if it's only a cosmetic item. Something I think that they could even look at doing too is doing this kind of solo mode content, but then giving like legendary skins or maybe skill effect animation changes or whatever. There's a variety of things that they could add as rewards to kind of entice players, but not make players feel like they need to go and do this thing if they don't want to. Okay, so before we get too far into the GIGA COPIUM stuff, I just want to also say that like my GIGA COPIUM list is not gonna be the best for Smilegate's wallet, right? Things that I want them to do for the game, they're most likely not gonna do, and they're not gonna do it because it's gonna lose them money. However, I think that this game makes a lot of money already, and they could afford, especially right now when their player base is kind of in the gutter, to show a little bit of good faith. there's a conversation that Bungie gave at a talk when they were doing well several years ago, and one of the things that they talked about was how they kind of won players back. And what they did first was they, wanted to get the trust back of the players and then have retention of those players before they started seeking out like financial opportunities and ways to make more money. And I think that that's really the process that Lost Ark needs to go through here. At this point, they really need to win players' trust back, especially, we see everyone playing MapleStory and stuff like that, right? Like, that's no coincidence. People are very not happy with the state of Lost Ark right now. And so winning players back before they pursue more monetization, I think would be the optimal solution here. And I think it would help them get a lot of good player will in the long run too, that will help maintain some of those players. You want people to be loyal to your MMO. You want them to look at your MMO and be like, that's my game. I'll defend that game with my life. Even though we shouldn't have as much tribalism in video games, I fully agree. But my point being is you do want people that are loyal to your game because that makes it easier for them to come back in the future, even if they do get upset or feel the need to quit. Okay, and this is maybe where we get into the GIGA COPIUM. Honestly, what I really want them to do is I really want them to come out and say, and this will never happen. I fully understand this will never happen. But I really want Smilegate to specifically come out and clarify that players aren't making the investment that they think they are. I think that it would get some backlash for sure, but I think it would also clarify what Smilegate wants to do with their monetization model. I think part of what has happened is that Smilegate wasn't entirely clear on like what it is they were trying to monetize on, and they're trying to monetize on too many things all at once, just being very greedy, which made players feel like, okay, well, if I'm going to spend this much money in the game, then it has to maintain asset value and stuff like that. And I think Smilegate needs to change the way that they look at things and kind of, be very open about how this is going to work. And in that whole idea, one of the changes that I want them to make is I want them to say, okay, we no longer have DPS and cooldown gems. There was this whole system that they came out with that was like binding gems, and then when they're bound, you can move them from cooldown to damage. We don't need that anymore. And I think this is becoming more and more obvious that like the gem system wasn't really designed very well. We should be able to just slot in a damage or there should just be like a tree that you open, and then you just slot in a gem for cooldown, or you slot in a gem for damage on that skill. And that should just be the way that it is. And you can only have so many equipped like the runes. And so I think that that would just ultimately fix at least a lot of these gem nuance problems. It kind of like, there's obviously going to be issues with the DPS gem and stuff like that losing more value, even though it's lost a lot of value even in KR. But to be honest, like, it just is so weird that you have to like roll the right gem and then you can't really move them back and forth. It should just be something really seamless, and you shouldn't have to go through this process of binding your gems to get this effect either. If you really want to play a different spec of your class, it should be as simple as drag and dropping. And I'm not sure why they haven't done that yet, but that would be how I would change things. And I think that's really one of the best things that they could do if they want to open up that flexibility. And then also kind of just stop with this whole gem nonsense that they're kind of building right now. This bound gem system, I think, is just like overcomplicating an issue that doesn't really need to exist. And to clarify, part of the reason why I had that little conversation about assets and stuff is because doing something like this would technically make it so that way you can move gems from one character to another and just slot them in. I think there's lots of other things that they can make money off of, and they clearly do, right? People are buying, especially those packages and stuff like that. When there's a juice package, we see numbers improve. And so it's not like one person wailing out is going to be more than the whole. But when they drop an insane package, the Steam chart numbers go up, right? So it's pretty important, I think, to recognize that they are over monetizing their game, and because of it, I think there's definitely some issues. Gems don't need to be the thing that they try and min max monetization on. people still can move towards getting level 10 gems and stuff like that. And like I said, I fully understand that like they're never gonna do this. This is my Giga Copium part of the wish list. Okay, so this is gonna be even more insane, okay? But this, hear me out for a second. Hear me out for a second. I want them to remove OREHA altogether, and instead, I want what you craft with your life skills and stuff like that is stuff like legendary skins. Now, I don't know how this really works over on the KR side. I don't know if their market is just always booming, but particularly in NA and more probably in NA West than anything else, we have an issue with bots. And those bots end up going and farming all the materials we need for OREHAs and stuff like that. The price ends up going up and down for the cost of OREHAs. And it just ends up being this really weird piece of the market that doesn't really need to exist. And it really is heavily influenced by how many bans there have been for bot waves. Ultimately, I think it would just be better to do something like legendary skins that are nice and can be used and can be sold, but maybe would take more effort, more involvement. Maybe it's not easy for a bot to do. And so ideally, try and change these things so that way bots can't really monetize off of it, but also kind of solve another problem that we had in the game, which was the lack of legendary skins. If you play an unpopular class right now and you look for a legendary skin on the auction house, you just won't be able to find them, at least on NA West. That's definitely been my experience, and the amount that we see, just even when things are popping, there's not that many because we just don't have that many players over in the global version of the game. So I think really changing structure of life skills and what they could give would be really, really valuable to the game and solve potentially a couple problems with one solution. It also can be solved with the things like the Mage Tower giving a legendary skin, for example, right? So things like that kind of solve other problems in a really cool way, I think would be really cool. I started editing my video actually, and I was thinking about it some more, and I really want to make sure this part is extra clear. So the reason why I think it would be better to do something like crafting legendary skins and maybe making that more involved. Maybe you have to go clear some raids or something and then get some parts, and then you have to go and grab some herbs or whatever. The reason why I wanted to kind of link that back to life skills, one, because of the bots. And if we did something like that, it would hit a point where instead of people would need to continue doing them all the time, everyone would have their skins or whatever, and so you wouldn't have to do them anymore. And so I think if they're not going to invest in life skills and actually make them fun or interesting, then they should kind of just let them fizzle out until they go and revamp them. And so that was kind of my whole point. Instead of keeping them tied to OREHA, which is very, very important for the entire game, letting them fizzle out and kind of fade into the background until they actually put some effort into doing them, I think is the correct play. Part of my COPIUM wish list is that we know that we're going to be getting a supporter change when we get the female Paladin later this summer, but I kind of want to have my COPIUM take on what I think that they're going to do and what I hope that they do is I hope that what they do is they actually nerf supports. So let me first explain before you get too angry. I can already hear the support mains and my support main friends being like, no, I don't want to nerf. We used to have something called loa logs before we had the new DPS meter, or I think it was called loa logs. Anyway, it was the other one, and it had something called RDPS. And so what it was basically like a visual representation of how much of your damage was given to you by your support. So it was the relative DPS of your support that was included in those damage meters. And what we found was that pretty oftentimes your supporter player was usually roughly 50 to like 60% of your overall damage. And that was, I think, back in the tower days. So it's probably even higher now. My point is that it's not really healthy for DPS players to only be, responsible for roughly 40% of their damage. That doesn't really make a lot of sense, and it also gives you straight up too much power to the support, where if you actually look at those DPS values, the person doing the most DPS in your team is actually your support player, because they're doing, you know, more than 50% of every other person on their party's damage. And so that kind of creates this problem where, obviously it's bad if a support dies or something like that, but it also means that there's a huge difference in your performance on whether or not you have a good or bad support. And so, for reference, that's part of the reason why people are so harsh when it comes to support uptime nowadays. And I think that needs to come down for sure. And the only real way to do that, I think, is to actually move away from a DPS needing to rely so heavily on their support for their damage, because it does make, like I said, an incredible difference. I wouldn't be surprised to hear that right now a support could be like, I don't know, maybe instead of 50 to 60%, it's like 55 to 70% of your damage or something at the end of the day. And so that's just kind of an insane thought to have, with all the like the new, brand power increases and everything like that. Your support player is just genuinely really, really important. But if you look at the raids that we have right now, so Belshazzar, Mordoom, stuff like that, I think you'll realize very quickly that you actually, even if they didn't give you a DPS increase, you wouldn't want to do those fights without a support. You're going to have to use a lot of consumables to try and make up for the fact that you don't have shields and stuff anymore. And some of the best patterns in the game to do DPS windows on right now all require that you have a support that knows what they're doing. And so my argument is that one thing that they could do, and what I hope that they do for supports here, is make it so that way they are responsible for far less of your damage as a DPS. So that would mean nerfing their buffs quite significantly. Now I think instead of, anywhere from like 50 to like whatever percent, supports should be looking at giving you roughly 30% of your overall damage, or maybe even a little bit less. The thing about that is, for your party, you have 3 DPS and a support. So in that case, it would be more DPS value to have a damage person instead of your support player, right? Just having another person doing more damage. And overall, that is true. However, that is kind of not really looking at the bigger picture. And it doesn't include things like you'd be missing out on shields, you'd be missing out on heals, you'd also be missing out on your movement speed buffs and stuff like that that you get very specifically from those supporter passives in the Arc passive tree. The thing about that is I think they can also supplement that and add more damage into the support players. If you take a look at what you're seeing probably in Mordoom or something, you'll notice that your supports can do, they might be doing like 5, 6, maybe 7 million DPS, as opposed to your DPS doing like, 100, 110, 120, even for normal Mordoom. And so the DPS difference between a support and a DPS is quite massive. So what I would want them to do is add some more damage as well into the support player, so that way they can kind of make up for that damage loss that the players will definitely incur when they nerf those buffs. So however they want to manage it out, maybe it's 30 30 10 instead of the 100% that you'd get from just having another damage dealer, whatever. I think that it's not even necessary to have that damage. I think even if ultimately you did get less damage, you would still take a support, because you kind of need them in order to greed those patterns, and you don't want to have to use all of your consumables all the time. So that's kind of one of the COPIUM takes that I have, and what I'm hoping they can kind of do to make supporters feel better too, is because if before you weren't doing any damage, if suddenly you're actually doing some damage and contributing to the boss dying, it is going to be more noticeable as well, because you're actually doing the damage now. You're not just buffing and then not seeing any numbers. You are actually seeing some numbers now, even if that's not, the most optimal way to maybe give that nice look and feel to the supporter class and make it feel better. I also, of course, want them to figure out some way to make it so that way supports do feel good about playing their class, but it is going to be, a little bit strange, and they'll have to figure out the best way to do that, whether that's showing numbers for how much damage someone's doing. Maybe you get to see those RDPS values. When someone hits the boss, you get to see how much you increase their damage or something like that. But I don't know how easy it is for them to do those calculations on the fly, etc. So they'll have to figure that out. But I just want them to rework supports in a way where, ideally, they're responsible for less of our damage as a DPS player. Anyway, those are my kind of takes on things that I want them to improve the most in Lost Ark. Obviously, there's more that they could do, and they could definitely change things in a lot of different ways that I didn't even mention here. Feel free to comment down below, like, subscribe the video if you want to see more, and you know, I'll catch you guys in the next one.